Okay guys, so let's look at a couple examples of how to solve these problems when faced with recessionary or inflationary gaps. First of all, let's identify what type of gap is represented by this graph. Alright, so if we look at this graph, we can see that we have a point of disequilibrium where output is below its full potential, which means that we have high unemployment. We can also see that we have a price level which has been affected by a reduction, in this case, in aggregate demand. Okay, so we would recognize this graph as a recessionary gap. And so what could the government do to close this recessionary gap? Well, they have two options. One, they could reduce taxes, or two, they could increase spending. So, increase spending, cut taxes, both of those things will be effective in impacting the aggregate demand to shift it back to long run. So basically what the government wants to do is shift the aggregate demand back to the right so that we can get back to the long run equilibrium. So therefore we would be back at long run in a fully employed economy. So should the government spend $100 billion to get back to long run? No, because there will be a multiplier effect. In other words, the government does not need to spend the full $100 billion to achieve long run equilibrium. Okay, now what information do they give us here? Well, they tell us what the marginal propensity to consume is. So essentially they're saying, hey, look, out of every dollar that someone receives, they're going to spend 50 cents of it. So what we need to determine now is what the spending multiplier is. Well, again, the spending multiplier is equal to 1 over the MPS, which in this case would be 0.5. So 1 over 0.5 is 2, and that would answer our question number 4. The next question says, how much does government need to spend to close the gap? All right, well, if our MPC is 2 and they need to close a gap of 100, well then basically they need to spend $50 billion in order to close this gap. So we know that the $50 billion is going to multiply 2 times its original amount to the desired $100 billion gap. Now, what if they decided to reduce taxes? Well, remember, the tax multiplier is always 1 less than the spending multiplier. So in this case, the tax multiplier is going to be equal to 1. All right, well, in order to get us back to long run and achieve that $100 billion gap, the government would need to cut taxes by the full $100 billion. So if the tax multiplier is 1, they would need to spend $100 billion to get to that desired result. And this question represents conceptually why the tax multiplier is lower than the spending multiplier. So the reason is that the government has to count on the people spending the money in order to close the gap. Okay, so here we go. We have another recessionary gap. And it looks like this is a gap of $40 billion. Now, the question is, how much should the government spend to close the gap if the MPC is 0.5? So if the MPC is 0.5, our spending multiplier, remember, is 1 over the MPS, or 1 over 0.5, which gives us 2. Now, they want to close this gap of $40 billion. They should spend X amount, which in this case would be $20 billion. 20 times 2 gives us 40, and that will close the gap. Okay, next question, how much should the government reduce taxes in order to close the gap of $40 billion? Now, in this case, they changed the MPC to 0.8. All right, so here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to figure out the spending multiplier first because that's easier to me. So 1 over the MPS is 1 over 0.2. 1 over 0.2 is 5. Okay, now, remember, the tax multiplier is always 1 less than the spending multiplier, so the tax multiplier is going to be 4. Now, they need to close this gap of $40 billion. 40 over 4 equals a $10 billion tax cut in order to close the recessionary gap. So in both of these problems, we looked at how to close a recessionary gap if the government is going to spend or provide a tax cut. All right, in this example, we have what's called an inflationary gap. Inflationary gaps are caused by usually increases in aggregate demand, which lead to an overstimulated economy. So we've seen this AD shift to the right to lead to this inflationary gap. Output is above normal, prices are above where they should be, so we got to get back to long-run equilibrium. Again, this is an inflationary gap. Now, what the government should do or could do to close this gap would be that they could increase taxes or reduce spending. Reduce the G component and reduce the C and the I component by increasing taxes. The question is, how much does the government need to reduce their spending in order to close this gap? All right, so if the MPC is 0.5, then our spending multiplier is going to be 1 over 0.5, which is going to be 2. And we have a $100 billion gap. And so what they need to do is they need to cut spending by $50 billion. Well, if the spending multiplier is 2, then the tax multiplier is always 1 less than the spending multiplier. So again, do a little division, 100 over 1. They would need to increase taxes by 100 billion. So again, we have how to solve both recessionary gaps and inflationary gaps on this graph. Thanks for watching. I hope that's clear. We're going to do some practice problems in the follow-up videos. And you can see here, once again, when in doubt, graph it out.